In the summer of 1943, over the endless expanse of the Pacific, Japanese pilots scanned the horizon with the confidence of those who had long claimed dominance of these skies. Their eyes, trained to identify the silhouettes of American aircraft, caught a new form. It was broad, heavy, and devoid of the elegance that had defined earlier U.S. fighters. At first glance it seemed slow, almost ponderous, an aircraft that, by all appearances, would succumb under fire. Veterans assumed it would fail as its predecessors had. They had flown against American machines before, memorized the patterns of weakness, the predictable arcs of survival and destruction. Yet, when tracer rounds struck its fuselage, it absorbed punishment in ways that defied expectation. Engines roared, metal shivered but held, and the plane pressed on, stubbornly resisting defeat. Within fleeting seconds, doubt crept into the thoughts of even the most seasoned aces. The initial engagements offered little clarity. One Japanese pilot rolled sharply, anticipating a kill, only to witness the Hellcat regain control with methodical steadiness. Another emptied his guns, tracers igniting the sky, and yet the aircraft refused to falter. The familiar choreography of air combat, speed, agility, maneuvering, seemed subtly altered. Each encounter revealed a machine that challenged conventional understanding, a design that would not yield to skill alone. Curiosity replaced indifference. Squadron reports, once filled with confident claims, now noted its endurance and resilience with quiet fascination. The Hellcat embodied a new philosophy of war, durability and firepower combined, forcing pilots to reconsider the calculus of victory. For the Japanese aviators, whose doctrine prized agility and individual mastery above all, the revelation was unmistakable. This was a fighter they could not dismiss. Above the endless blue, the Pacific War pressed forward, but a quiet unease had taken root. What they did not yet know was that this seemingly unremarkable aircraft would soon rewrite the rules of the air and force a reckoning with everything they believed they knew. At altitudes familiar to Japanese pilots, the early morning sun glinting off the Pacific below, the dogfights began with a sense of routine. Pilots twisted and rolled through patterns they had practiced for years, confident that their speed and agility would decide the outcome before the enemy could even fire. But the new American fighter, later called the Hellcat, did not conform to expectation. The Hellcat refused to engage in turning contests. Where Japanese aces banked and spun to gain the inside advantage, the American pilots climbed and dived with deliberate precision, trading maneuverability for bursts of speed and altitude. They did not chase recklessly, nor did they gamble on instinct alone. Each engagement ended on their terms, leaving Japanese pilots frustrated and increasingly uncertain. Tracer rounds tore through the sky, striking the aircraft in places that would have grounded any other fighter. Yet time and again, the Hellcat held, shrugging off damage that should have been fatal. Even as Japanese guns spat fire, the enemy returned again and again, relentless in its persistence. The familiar rhythm of attack and retreat was broken, replaced by a subtle but undeniable shift in control. Reports filtered back to Japanese command, but the numbers did not capture the unease. Losses seemed heavier than they should have, pilots returning damaged but alive, their tales contradicting initial claims of victory. Confidence, once implicit, now required constant reaffirmation. For the first time, seasoned veterans began to question whether their tactics, the very foundation of their doctrine, were sufficient against this new foe. Something in the balance had shifted. The Pacific, long a domain of assured dominance, no longer felt entirely predictable. Each encounter with the Hellcat carried a quiet, growing tension, a sense that mastery of the sky might no longer be assured by skill alone. By late 1943, reports filtered back from the Pacific that the Hellcat was returning from missions scarred and battered. Wings bore the marks of tracer fire, fuselages were punctured, and engine panels smoked from near misses. Yet pilots climbed from the cockpits alive, the aircraft somehow holding together against odds that should have been fatal. Each return flight carried a message that was subtle but unmistakable. This was a machine built to endure. Japanese claims of victory no longer aligned with reality. A fighter thought destroyed reappeared hours later, limping home to tell a different story. The careful tally of kills, once a measure of confidence and skill, now betrayed the gaps between expectation and outcome. Where once certainty had been unchallenged, now quiet doubt began to take root. Confidence eroded slowly, almost imperceptibly, in the spaces between engagements. Combat narratives among Japanese pilots began to shift. Reports of easy victories dwindled. Survivors' stories described opponents who absorbed fire without faltering, who maneuvered with precision under duress, and who pressed attacks relentlessly. Among American pilots, the Hellcat's reputation grew steadily, whispered in mess halls and flight decks alike. A fighter that could take punishment, deliver punishment, and return to fight again. The psychological impact was immediate, if subtle. Veterans who had relied on instinct and speed now paused to reconsider. The previous rhythm of dogfights, confidence, attack, retreat, felt altered. Each damaged Hellcat that returned to base became a signal, an embodiment of the industrial and tactical advantages that Americans were beginning to wield with methodical patience. Shock, once raw, transformed into a quiet, uneasy reassessment. Japanese pilots had always measured skill against skill, but now they faced a test of endurance and system over individual mastery. The sky itself seemed to shift, offering no easy victories and hinting at a new balance of power. Before the war, Japanese doctrine had been painstakingly codified. Manuals and training emphasized one principle above all: maneuverability. A pilot's skill, reflexes and daring were considered decisive, capable of determining the outcome of any engagement. The aircraft was an extension of the individual, a tool meant to respond to instinct and intuition. In these teachings, firepower was secondary. Speed and agility ruled the sky. The Zero, lightweight and elegant, became the standard bearer of this philosophy. It could climb sharply, turn on a dime, and vanish into the clouds before an enemy could react. Its success in early battles seemed to validate every assumption about air combat. Construction mattered as much as doctrine. Lightweight materials, delicate airframes, and minimal armor were all deliberate choices, each reflecting the belief that an aircraft's survival depended on avoiding fire rather than absorbing it. Pilots trained relentlessly to exploit these characteristics, mastering tight turns, high-speed rolls, and sudden dives that could outmatch any adversary. Victory was not measured merely by enemy losses, but by the demonstration of individual mastery in the air. American pilots, by contrast, were viewed as rigid. The Japanese believed that U.S. aviators relied heavily on formation, procedure, and numbers rather than instinct and finesse. While effective in some contexts, this rigidity was assumed to be exploitable. The Japanese approach celebrated the duel, the intimate struggle of one pilot against another, where skill, intuition, and courage dictated the outcome. Doctrine encouraged aggressiveness, boldness, and the calculated risk that often proved fatal to less disciplined opponents. These beliefs shaped every engagement, influencing how squadrons approached the enemy and how aces measured success. The Zero's capabilities reinforced the sense of invulnerability. Pilots flew with the confidence that speed, turning ability, and personal judgment would carry them through any confrontation. The assumption was that any American aircraft could be outmaneuvered, outsmarted, or outturned. Losses were seen as lapses in judgment rather than reflections of systemic weakness. Yet in 1943, as Hellcats began to appear, the foundation of this doctrine would face subtle but unrelenting challenges. Machines built for durability and concentrated firepower confronted a philosophy that had prized finesse over resilience. The ideals that had guided Japanese aviators for years, confidence in the individual, faith in agility, dismissal of brute strength, were about to be tested in ways no pilot had anticipated. In the opening months of the Pacific War, Early American fighters often struggled against the tactics honed by Japanese pilots over decades of training. Machines such as the F4F Wildcat lacked the speed and climb of the Zero, and crews were frequently unprepared for the aggressive, highly coordinated maneuvers employed by Japanese aces. In those initial engagements, the pattern seemed clear. Japanese pilots dominated the skies, outturning and outmaneuvering their adversaries with devastating efficiency. Victory in these encounters reinforced confidence at every level. Individual skill had triumphed again, and it was interpreted as proof that doctrine was correct, that agility and instinct were decisive. Reports returned to command centers not only celebrated the success of aces, but also codified it into broader institutional certainty. Adaptation appeared unnecessary. Training manuals, once questioned, were validated by the consistency of triumph. The belief that the Japanese approach to air combat was inherently superior hardened with every tally of destroyed enemy aircraft. Warnings about potential American innovation, improvements in pilot training, or aircraft design were often discounted. Early fighter struggles were seen as anomalies rather than indicators of systemic change. To the Japanese command, the U.S. Navy's capacity for production or doctrinal adjustment seemed unlikely to match the skill and tradition embedded in their own forces. Confidence became not merely personal, but institutional, spreading quietly through every squadron, every briefing, and every strategic assumption. Underestimation became a certainty. The mindset that American pilots were rigid, predictable, and inferior was reinforced by repeated victories. Japanese airmen approached each engagement with the expectation of success, relying on tactics that had served them well, unaware that these victories had lulled them into a complacency that masked the evolving threat. In the skies over the Pacific, what was perceived as skill and dominance was, in some cases, an illusion supported by the limitations of the enemy's early aircraft. The consequence was subtle but profound. Every victory against the F4F and similar models deepened the belief in doctrine, while early signs of American innovation, heavier armor, more powerful engines, coordinated team tactics, were dismissed. By the time these indicators could no longer be ignored, the foundation of Japanese confidence would already have begun to crack. By the time the F6F Hellcat began appearing over the Pacific, Japanese pilots had already formed an impression, and it was dismissive. Its lines were broad and ungainly, lacking the lithe elegance of the Zero that had defined Japanese air superiority for years. In the hands of seasoned observers, the Hellcat seemed heavy, sluggish, a machine that might buckle under fire rather than exploit the agility so valued by their doctrine. Appearances mattered, and on first sight, the aircraft appeared ordinary, almost unwieldy. This judgment was reinforced by weight. The Hellcat's broad fuselage, substantial wingspan and armor suggested sluggish performance. Pilots accustomed to tracking the subtle curves of the Zero's frame interpreted its bulk as a liability. The notion of speed and precision winning battles was deeply ingrained. Anything that appeared heavy was assumed to be slow, vulnerable, and predictable. Confidence in this visual assessment became instinct, a lens through which every encounter would be interpreted. Early engagements confirmed expectations, at least superficially. Japanese pilots noted the Hellcat climbing or diving with steady, deliberate motions that appeared cautious, not aggressive. In brief clashes, it seemed incapable of exploiting tactical openings, retreating when pressed rather than striking decisively. These encounters masked its true strengths: a powerful Pratt & Whitney engine, structural resilience, concentrated firepower, and a design philosophy that rewarded energy tactics over delicate maneuvering. The aircraft that appeared ponderous was, in reality, a carefully engineered instrument of attrition and dominance. Japanese intelligence compounded the misjudgment. Reconnaissance and reports underestimated American engineering and production capacity. Designers and strategists failed to recognize that the Hellcat was not merely another fighter, but the product of deliberate industrial foresight, armor for survival, firepower to overwhelm, and an engine built to endure the rigors of prolonged combat. Yet these insights were overlooked, overshadowed by assumptions formed in the air, by the instinctive prioritization of appearance over performance. Tactical habits persisted unchallenged. Pilots relied on familiar maneuvers, turning contests, and calculated duels that had always delivered results. Early reports of Hellcat performance were dismissed as anomalies, and the aircraft was treated as though it could be defeated by conventional methods. Misjudgment became systemic. The combination of doctrine, visual bias, and institutional overconfidence blinded squadrons to the emerging reality. The Hellcat would not yield to assumptions. Confidence remained, even as the aircraft survived fire and returned to base. Every engagement reinforced a sense of familiarity, a belief that success remained inevitable. Yet beneath the surface, a quiet danger was growing. By focusing on appearances, clinging to doctrine, and underestimating innovation, Japanese pilots and command had created the conditions for a profound reversal. The very air they thought they mastered would soon teach them a lesson in hubris and adaptation. The F6F Hellcat was born not from elegance but from necessity. Where earlier American fighters had sought balance between agility and firepower, the Hellcat was conceived for endurance, for survival in a sky increasingly dominated by skillful adversaries. Every rivet, every panel, every internal system reflected a design philosophy that prioritized reliability and protection over the delicate grace that Japanese doctrine revered. Durability was not incidental. It was strategic. Armor plates lined critical sections of the fuselage, and self-sealing fuel tanks ensured that a hit did not become a catastrophe. Pilots who climbed into the cockpit were shielded by the knowledge that the machine itself would absorb punishment, that mechanical resilience could outlast the fleeting precision of a dogfight. In an era where aerial combat often ended in a matter of seconds, survival became a matter of design as much as skill. The Hellcat's very structure challenged the assumption that victory belonged solely to the nimble and daring. At its heart, the aircraft carried the Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine, a powerhouse that combined raw force with consistent reliability. In combat, the engine allowed rapid climbs, sustained speed, and a margin of error that pilots could rely upon. The Hellcat could dive with authority, accelerate out of danger, and recover without the fragility that had plagued earlier U.S. designs. It was an engine that transformed potential into kinetic dominance, turning the sky into a domain where endurance and energy, not just maneuver, dictated advantage. Firepower was concentrated and precise. 650 caliber Browning machine guns, mounted in the wings, provided overwhelming offensive capability. Ammunition could be delivered in bursts that shredded aircraft fabric and pierced light armor, making every shot count. Combined with the aircraft's capacity to survive, this concentrated lethality allowed American pilots to approach engagements with a confidence that had previously been the exclusive domain of aces. The Hellcat's advantage was not in subtlety, but in decisive, repeatable impact. Where Japanese doctrine prized turning contests, the Hellcat favored energy tactics, boom and zoom attacks, altitude advantage, and rapid disengagement. Agility was sacrificed in favor of predictable performance at the points in combat that mattered most. Pilots learned quickly that survival and victory were closely aligned. The aircraft allowed them to choose the moment to strike, and, crucially, to withdraw intact to fight again. Each encounter became an exercise in strategic calculation, not improvisational risk. Design reflected industrial priorities as much as tactical ones. The Hellcat could be produced in large numbers without sacrificing quality or performance. Standardization ensured that pilots could enter the cockpit with confidence, knowing that the aircraft before them was capable of matching every challenge the Pacific could present. American industry, coordinated with doctrine, had created a system in which skill and machine worked in concert, where survival was engineered into every component. In essence, the Hellcat was built for a different kind of war, a war of endurance, industrial scale, and methodical execution. It did not merely oppose the Japanese in the air, it transformed the rules of engagement. Its very existence forced adversaries to reconsider the assumptions that had governed aerial combat for years, revealing that a fighter could be both resilient and lethal, both strategic and precise. The aircraft became a silent teacher of a new reality. The air was no longer a realm of aces alone, but of systems, design, and survival. As the Hellcat began to take its place in the Pacific skies, another transformation was quietly unfolding behind the scenes: the training of the pilots who would wield it. The U.S. Navy had expanded its programs at an unprecedented pace, establishing schools and flight programs that churned out aviators in numbers few could match. Each pilot emerged not only with skill, but with an understanding of tactics and doctrine designed to exploit the Hellcat's strengths. Production alone did not guarantee advantage. It was the system that would turn potential into mastery. Tactics emphasized teamwork over individual duels. Whereas Japanese doctrine celebrated the decisive action of a single ace, American strategy prioritized coordinated strikes, mutual support, and disciplined formations. Squadrons trained relentlessly to act as a unit, each pilot aware of his position, his role, and the broader rhythm of combat. In practice, this meant that while one pilot drew attention, others could strike decisively, ensuring that the advantages built into the aircraft were fully realized. Individual skill was important, but it was magnified when integrated into a larger cohesive effort. Discipline and restraint were drilled into every pilot. Engagements were not left to instinct alone. Maneuvers were calculated, patience emphasized over aggression, and retreats were recognized as a valid and often necessary tactic. Combat experience from the front lines was quickly incorporated into doctrine, feeding back into training so that lessons were standardized across the fleet. Pilots learned from one another, and the system itself adapted faster than the pace of battle. Losses were absorbed with remarkable efficiency. When a pilot fell in combat, the training pipeline replaced him swiftly, ensuring that squadrons remained operational and effective. Skill became standardized. The variability inherent in individual talent was supplemented by rigorous procedures, repeated drills, and an unwavering emphasis on coordination. The Hellcat, designed to survive punishment, now had in its pilots a complement of disciplined operators capable of maximizing its strengths repeatedly and reliably. The maturation of this system was subtle, but profound. What had begun as a collection of aircraft and individuals evolved into a coherent machine of war. Pilots entered the air with confidence in themselves and in one another, their training reinforcing trust in the aircraft, in strategy, and in the unseen infrastructure of maintenance and command. Each engagement became not only a test of skill, but a demonstration of an industrial and tactical ecosystem that was beginning to outpace the ad hoc methods of their adversaries. By the end of 1943, the combination of Hellcat design and American training had created a force that was durable, lethal, and methodically prepared. In the Pacific skies, this synergy began to tip the balance. Pilots no longer relied solely on instinct or improvisation. They had become instruments of a system designed for repeated success, where each maneuver, each burst of fire, and each tactical choice was informed by a collective knowledge that had been codified, drilled, and honed in classrooms and flight decks thousands of miles from the front lines. Japanese pilots approached the skies with habits ingrained over years of doctrine and combat. They banked sharply, rolled tightly, and sought the familiar inside advantage that had won countless engagements. Each maneuver was executed with confidence, a rhythm honed through repetition and reinforced by early victories. They expected their adversaries to respond predictably, to bend to skill and intuition. But the Hellcat refused to conform to expectation. The F6F counters were subtle but relentless. It exploited altitude and speed in ways that Japanese aviators had learned to respect in theory, but rarely encountered in practice. Boom and zoom tactics became the signature of American engagements. Pilots would dive from above with devastating velocity, fire with concentrated precision, and climb again before the Japanese could respond. Each assault was brief, each strike lethal, leaving almost no margin for error. Traditional turning duels, once the hallmark of air combat, were now ineffective. Encounters grew shorter and deadlier. What had once been protracted contests of skill now resolved in moments, each decision weighted by speed, firepower, and survival. Pilots who had relied on agility to escape found themselves unable to evade Hellcats descending from the sun or climbing to positions of advantage. The sky, once a space where skill could triumph over numbers, now demanded adaptation, and adaptation was slow. Escape became increasingly difficult. Japanese aces who attempted maneuvers that had once guaranteed survival found themselves outpaced, outgunned, and exposed. The combination of Hellcat resilience, concentrated firepower, and American tactical discipline left little room for improvisation. Pilots were forced to confront the limitations of both machine and doctrine, recognizing that survival was no longer assured by instinct or experience alone. Losses began to accelerate. Squadrons that had once returned with minimal damage now suffered multiple casualties in a single engagement. Veteran pilots fell, and with each loss, the knowledge embedded in experience was erased, leaving younger aviators to face a relentless foe with fewer mentors to guide them. What had once seemed predictable, the cadence of battle, the rhythm of attack and retreat, now dissolved into chaos. Fear entered the cockpit. It was not the raw panic of inexperience, but a measured, insidious apprehension. Pilots sensed the widening gap between expectation and reality, the growing superiority of a system they could not yet comprehend. Even the most confident aces found themselves hesitating, calculating risks where instinct had previously sufficed. The psychological weight of the Hellcat's design, combined with disciplined American tactics, altered the very nature of engagement, replacing certainty with caution, skill with calculation, and confidence with unease. By the end of these encounters, it was clear that familiar maneuvers no longer guaranteed dominance. The Pacific skies had changed, and the Hellcat had become more than a machine. It was a signal that air combat had evolved. Japanese pilots could still fight, still demonstrate individual mastery, but the rules they had relied upon were no longer operative. The balance had shifted decisively toward a system of endurance, precision, and industrially backed capability. June 1944 arrived over the Pacific with a clash that would define the course of aerial warfare in the region. The Marianas became the stage for a series of massive carrier battles, where hundreds of aircraft from both sides converged in the skies above. The scale was unprecedented, formations stretching for miles, pilots navigating the chaos of friend and foe, the air thick with the roar of engines and the streak of tracer fire. It was a test of both human skill and industrial might, a confrontation where every element of strategy and design would be measured in losses and survival. Hellcats met Japanese formations en masse, no longer in isolated duels, but in coordinated waves that leveraged both altitude and disciplined tactics. The American pilots executed radar-guided interceptions with precision, striking as enemy aircraft approached, descending in calculated attacks that minimized exposure while maximizing lethality. The combination of the Hellcat's durability, concentrated firepower, and methodical American planning transformed the air into a landscape where control could be imposed, rather than contested, through skill alone. Japanese losses became catastrophic in a matter of hours. Squadrons that had once returned intact now faltered under the relentless pressure. Veteran pilots, the aces whose reputations had dominated early campaigns, fell in numbers that stunned their command. In some formations, more than half of the experienced flyers were lost in single sorties, leaving the less experienced to face an enemy they no longer outmatched. The cumulative effect was immediate. Not only were planes destroyed, but the knowledge, instincts and experience embedded in seasoned aviators were erased almost instantly. Air superiority shifted decisively. The psychological impact was as significant as the material one. Japanese commanders could no longer rely on confidence in maneuver or skill alone. The American combination of industrial preparation, training and aircraft design now dictated the tempo of engagement. The Marianas battles revealed that dominance in the air was no longer a function solely of individual mastery. It was a system, a synthesis of machine, pilot, and doctrine executed with unerring precision. The turning point was undeniable. From the decks of carriers, pilots and commanders alike recognized that the war in the Pacific had entered a new phase. The Hellcat, once underestimated, now validated its design philosophy in full. Resilience, lethality, and disciplined application of tactics created a force capable of overwhelming previously invincible formations. Every maneuver, every dive, every coordinated strike reinforced the lesson that the balance of power in the air had irrevocably shifted. In the aftermath, the Marianas became both a battlefield and a measure of industrial and tactical superiority. The losses were counted not only in aircraft, but in the intangible assets of experience, training, and morale. Japanese pilots who survived returned with stories of overwhelming firepower and unyielding tactics, their doctrine challenged and their assumptions shattered. The Pacific skies had changed, and the Hellcat had demonstrated that air superiority was no longer merely won by skill, but by design, discipline, and systemic mastery. In the months following the Marianas, Japanese commanders were forced to confront a reality they had long refused to acknowledge. Reports from surviving pilots detailed engagements that had decimated squadrons in hours. The patterns were unmistakable. The Hellcat, once underestimated, dominated the skies not through luck or occasional brilliance, but through a combination of durability, firepower, and disciplined tactics. The lessons came too late for those who had relied on instinct, agility, and doctrine alone. Avoidance replaced aggression. Where previously Japanese pilots had sought confrontation, now caution dictated movement. Squadrons flew with hesitancy, choosing to evade rather than engage, to retreat rather than risk annihilation. The aces who had once been symbols of audacity now became scarce, their presence replaced by inexperienced aviators, aware that any miscalculation could be fatal. Commanders adjusted orders not to seek victory, but to minimize loss, a stark reversal of previous doctrine. The training pipelines could not recover the pace of attrition. Experienced pilots were lost faster than replacements could be trained, and the system that had once produced dominance could not keep pace with destruction. Knowledge embedded in years of combat, anticipation, reflex, tactical judgment, vanished with each downed veteran. Raw numbers of aircraft mattered less than the absence of wisdom, and the Japanese air arm found itself increasingly incapable of mounting coordinated or effective resistance. The Hellcat began to rule uncontested skies. Pilots returning from sorties recounted that the enemy seemed always present, striking with precision, then withdrawing before retaliation could be mounted. The aircraft's combination of resilience and lethality, coupled with American tactical discipline, made each engagement a gamble Japanese aviators were increasingly unwilling to take. The psychological weight of this dominance became as significant as the material losses it produced. Fear became operational reality. It was no longer a matter of personal hesitation. It spread across units, shaping doctrine and strategy. Pilots approached each sortie aware that even their best maneuvers might fail against an aircraft designed to endure, strike, and survive. The lessons of the Hellcat were imposed from the top down. Formations adjusted, engagements delayed, and opportunities for bold action evaporated. Confidence, once a cornerstone of Japanese air combat, had been replaced by caution, calculation, and apprehension. The balance was irreversibly broken. The Pacific skies that had once been a stage for individual mastery now belonged to a system. American industrial capacity, tactical innovation, and aircraft design integrated into a force that could sustain losses, adapt rapidly, and impose control. The Hellcat had not merely survived, it had demonstrated that superiority was not measured in aces or doctrine alone, but in the combination of machine, pilot, and systemic discipline. By the close of these months, the implications were clear. Japanese air power, once feared and dominant, had been humbled. The mistakes of underestimation, the reliance on doctrine over adaptation, and the failure to recognize the strategic value of resilience and systematized training had compounded into a defeat not easily reversed. In the skies above the Pacific, the lesson of the Hellcat was written in steel, fire, and the silence of those who would not return. By late 1944, the tone of Japanese combat diaries had shifted markedly. Where once the aircraft of the US Navy had been dismissed with casual contempt, now they were described with measured caution. Pilots recounted engagements in which the Hellcat's durability had saved its operator from attacks that, on paper, should have been decisive. Notes and reports emphasized survivability, recording damage that American planes endured and yet continued to fight. The stories revealed not bravado, but recognition of a machine and an opponent that demanded respect. Firepower, too, was repeatedly noted. Accounts detailed the concentrated might of the Hellcat's 650 caliber machine guns, describing how bursts could shred lightly armored wings, tear fuselage panels, and overwhelm maneuvering attempts. Japanese pilots spoke of the psychological impact as much as the material. Even a brief exposure to the aircraft's guns forced rapid decisions, often in favor of disengagement rather than contest. Where they had once relied on speed and turning advantage, they now faced an opponent capable of delivering lethal punishment before they could respond. Engagements were increasingly avoided when possible. Japanese pilots, aware that even experienced aces could be felled in moments, began to calculate risk differently. Patrols would retreat to safer altitudes, formations would adjust to minimize exposure, and aggressive encounters became rare. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. Fear was no longer individual hesitation, but an operational consideration integrated into every decision. Survival, rather than glory, had become the guiding principle of action. Respect replaced contempt. Veteran aces, who had once scoffed at the Hellcat's bulk and perceived sluggishness, acknowledged in private reports that its endurance, firepower, and tactical employment made it formidable. Squadrons adapted their behavior, changing routes, flight patterns, and engagement strategies. The aircraft that had been underestimated had earned its place in the narrative of the Pacific War, not through spectacle or legend, but through quiet, relentless efficiency. Confidence, long a hallmark of Japanese air superiority, collapsed incrementally. Pilots who had relied on doctrine and personal mastery now confronted the reality of an opponent that neutralized their advantages systematically. Training, skill, and experience were no longer sufficient shields against the combination of Hellcat design and disciplined American tactics. Each sortie, each narrow escape, reinforced the message. The balance of power in the air had irrevocably shifted. Yet fear was acknowledged without exaggeration. Reports did not descend into hyperbole or panic. Instead, they documented fact with precision, recording losses, near misses, and tactical lessons. There was recognition of American ingenuity, of coordinated systems, and of the aircraft's capacity to endure and dominate. It was a fear tempered by understanding, a sober acknowledgement that the assumptions guiding air combat for years were no longer valid. In sum, the diaries and reports of Japanese pilots revealed a quiet but profound transformation in perspective. Where once contempt had ruled, now respect and caution prevailed. The Hellcat had forced a re-evaluation of strategy, doctrine, and expectation, leaving Japanese airmen to grapple with a reality they had once refused to see. It was a reckoning in words and deeds, and in the Pacific sky, the lesson had been taught through steel, fire, and survival. By late 1944, the cumulative impact of misjudging the Hellcat had become starkly apparent. Japanese air power was bleeding, and the losses were irreplaceable. Veteran pilots, the aces whose skill and experience had sustained operations for years, were gone, replaced by younger aviators with far less training and little battlefield wisdom. Each lost pilot represented not only a fighter removed from the skies, but also a body of knowledge and instinct that could never be fully recovered. The attrition was swift, unforgiving, and merciless. Industrial limits compounded the crisis. Whereas the United States could replace aircraft and pilots with speed and consistency, Japan's factories could not match the demands of a modern, large-scale war. Tactical brilliance, long the hallmark of Japanese operations, proved insufficient against a system designed for endurance, scale, and sustained combat. One exceptional maneuver or daring sortie could not offset the steady, systematic losses inflicted by the Hellcat and the pilots trained to maximize its potential. Attrition favored American systems. The Hellcat's survivability ensured that even heavily damaged aircraft returned to service, while U.S. pilots emerged from combat with lessons immediately integrated into doctrine and training. Battles no longer measured success merely in kills. They measured the resilience and depth of the system. Japan's losses, in contrast, were permanent, eroding both material and morale, weakening the ability to contest airspace with the same confidence. The impact of the Hellcat extended beyond individual battles. Its presence shaped strategic decisions, forced avoidance, and reshaped doctrines in ways that were impossible to ignore. Air superiority was no longer a local contest, but a determinant of operational freedom across the Pacific. Carrier groups, supply lines, and amphibious operations all depended on control of the skies, and the Hellcat, once underestimated, had become the instrument by which the Americans enforced that control. Every misjudgment carried a price. Early dismissal of the Hellcat's design and capabilities, the reliance on traditional doctrine, and the failure to anticipate the integration of training, industry, and tactical innovation left the Japanese air forces vulnerable. The consequences were measured not only in destroyed aircraft or lost pilots, but in the strategic leverage surrendered to an enemy who had recognized the potential of the system as a whole. In essence, the cost of underestimation was more than a tally of material losses. It was the erosion of confidence, the collapse of experience, and the forced surrender to a new kind of air warfare, one where individual skill mattered less than systemic advantage. By the end of 1944, the Hellcat had ensured that Japanese air power could no longer dictate the terms of engagement. The Pacific skies were no longer theirs to claim, and the lesson was written in the casualties, the abandoned tactics, and the silence of the pilots who would never return. The Hellcat came to embody a new paradigm of warfare, one in which industry, design, and discipline converged to redefine the air war. No longer was aerial combat merely a contest of individual skill, where the bravest and most agile pilot dictated the outcome. The Hellcat demonstrated that survivability, standardized training, and tactical cohesion could achieve results that heroic feats alone could not. In its fuselage and wings, the philosophy of industrial warfare was made tangible, a machine whose very design dictated both endurance and dominance. Elegance had once been prized above all. Aircraft were celebrated for sleek lines, light frames, and the delicate balance that allowed agility to prevail. The Hellcat, by contrast, favored substance over appearance. Armor, self-sealing fuel tanks, and structural reinforcement made it heavier, less graceful, yet far more resilient. Its form was utilitarian, almost austere, yet within that functionality lay a profound lesson. Victory depended not on beauty or finesse, but on the marriage of engineering, firepower, and tactical application. Training systems amplified this advantage. Pilots were no longer left to instinct alone. They were integrated into a network of coordinated operations, drilled in maneuvers that exploited the Hellcat's strengths. Discipline and repetition allowed individual courage to flourish within a framework that magnified effectiveness. In this environment, heroism was not diminished. It was harnessed, supported by the certainty that each aircraft, squadron, and tactic had been designed to succeed collectively. Air combat became procedural in a sense that Japanese doctrine had never anticipated. Engagements were guided by planning, intelligence, and industrial foresight. The unpredictability of dogfights, once the domain of experience and instinct, was tempered by systems capable of reproducing success at scale. Pilots became instruments within a broader strategy, where individual initiative mattered, but the system ensured that each action contributed to overarching dominance. Japanese doctrine, long reliant on the supremacy of skill and maneuver, was outpaced. What had once been a battlefield where agility and audacity ruled was now dominated by survivability, concentrated firepower, and the steady enforcement of systemic advantage. The Hellcat, once underestimated, had become the vector through which the nature of air combat itself was transformed, leaving those who relied solely on personal mastery at a profound disadvantage. In essence, the Hellcat redefined modern air war. It was more than a fighter. It was a statement of strategic foresight. Its presence illustrated how industrial capacity, tactical innovation, and coordinated training could combine to dominate skies previously ruled by heroism alone. The aircraft became a symbol not of individual supremacy, but of an integrated approach where endurance, firepower, and systems thinking dictated the flow of battle. In the quiet that followed combat, Japanese pilots reflected on what had been lost and what had been learned too late. Diaries and after-action reports captured the contours of surprise, the subtle erosion of confidence, and the realization that early assumptions had been naive. The aircraft they once dismissed as heavy and ungainly had revealed itself to be precise, resilient, and deadly. The Hellcat had become a symbol not only of technological superiority, but of reversal, a measure of the danger inherent in underestimating an opponent. Fear replaced confidence, but it was a measured fear, born of repeated encounters and the inexorable logic of survival. Pilots who had once flown with boldness now approached each sortie with caution, mindful that agility and skill alone were insufficient against a system designed for endurance, concentration of firepower, and disciplined execution. The Pacific skies, once familiar and predictable, now demanded respect, planning, and an acknowledgement of limits. The lesson was exacting and relentless, yet imparted without drama. War teaches quietly, its corrections delivered in steel and fire rather than rhetoric. This transformation was recorded without judgment. Historians, pilots, and strategists could note the shift in Japanese attitudes, the erosion of doctrine, and the recalibration of tactics, yet the narratives were factual rather than accusatory. The Hellcat's impact was systemic. It altered perceptions, strategies, and expectations simultaneously. The aircraft embodied both the promise of industrial foresight and the peril of misjudgment, demonstrating that even the most confident forces could be humbled when they failed to anticipate innovation, resilience, and coordination. For the men who faced it, the Hellcat was a teacher of sorts. Every engagement it survived, every attack it delivered and absorbed, carried the quiet authority of inevitability. Early encounters, once trivialized, were now recognized as the harbingers of a broader truth. The war in the air was no longer a contest of instinct and daring alone, but a confrontation between systems, planning, and preparation. Those who underestimated it had paid the price, and the recognition of that price shaped the conduct of every subsequent mission. In the end, the lesson of the Hellcat was both profound and elegantly simple. They had underestimated it at first, viewing it with skepticism and, in some cases, derision. But in time, through encounters that tested endurance, skill, and courage, they had learned to fear it. That fear was neither sensational nor exaggerated. It was precise, earned through experience, and reflective of a larger truth about warfare. That misjudgment, even in small degrees, can have consequences that echo far beyond the cockpit.